Lady Dimitrescu, the 9-foot-tall vampire mommy who had the entire internet barking. Capcom really dropped her into Resident Evil Village for 5 minutes, and somehow, that was enough to make half the player base reconsider their survival instincts. But while she might seem like pure horror game gold, she was loosely inspired by a real-life historical figure. And trust me, the real story isn't any less disturbing. Meet Elizabeth Báthory, a 16th century Hungarian noblewoman whose reputation is basically Dracula meets Saw. According to legend, she was obsessed with staying young forever and believed that bathing in the blood of young women would keep her looking fresh. Did she actually do it? Historians debate it, but what's confirmed is that she was accused of abducting, torturing, and murdering hundreds of peasant girls in her castle. Lady Dimitrescu? Same energy. She's a towering aristocrat who rules over Castle Dimitrescu, feasts on the blood of maidens, and treats humans like wine bottles waiting to be uncorked. Both women had loyal followers, both lived in secluded castles, and both had a horrifying talent for making sure their victims never left. The difference? Lady Double D's has a supernatural excuse. Báthory? Not so much. Of course, Dimitrescu met her end in a Resident Evil boss fight, whereas Báthory was bricked into a room in her own castle and left to die. Either way, not a great way to go. But let's be real. The scariest part of Resident Evil Village? That Lady D wasn't in it longer. Shou Tucker. Shou Tucker isn't just a villain. He's the reason anime fans have trust issues. At first glance, he seems harmless. A soft-spoken scientist, big round glasses, a nervous smile. Oh, and an adorable daughter named Nina with her fluffy dog, Alexander. But if you've watched Fullmetal Alchemist, you already know. This is a setup. Tucker wasn't just a bad father. He saw the worst dad ever leaderboard, laughed, and decided to set an unbeatable world record. When the government pressured him to prove his alchemy skills, he looked at his daughter, looked at his dog, and said, "What if one pet instead of two?" And suddenly, Nina and Alexander weren't speaking, just whimpering. Now, while there's no official confirmation that Tucker was based on anyone real, his character shares some seriously unsettling similarities with Josef Mengele, the Nazi doctor who saw human suffering as an opportunity for twisted science. Mengele sewed twins together, injected chemicals into kids' eyes, and treated people like living lab rats. Like Tucker, he operated under the guise of scientific progress, while committing unspeakable acts. Both men had the same cold detachment, the same smug justification, and the same, "Wow, I really hope karma shows up" energy. And it did. Mengele died of a stroke while swimming, while Tucker got turned into street art by a vengeful chimera. Guess he got tuckered out. Funny enough, that street art spelled out, "Subscribe to this channel right now." Wild coincidence, right? Norman Bates. At first glance, he's just a quiet, polite guy running a lonely little roadside motel. Maybe a bit socially awkward, but harmless, right? Wrong. In Psycho 1960, Norman isn't just a mama's boy. He is his mama. Literally. And if you check into the Bates Motel, don't expect a checkout time. Expect a kitchen knife to the chest. Sounds too disturbing to be made up? That's because it wasn't. Norman was directly inspired by Ed Gein, one of the most infamous real-life killers in American history. Like Norman, Gein had an unhealthy attachment to his mother, so much so that when she died, he basically lost his grip on reality. While Norman kept his mother's corpse in the house and became her to commit murders, Gein took it to the next level, robbing graves, collecting body parts, and turning them into furniture, clothing, and decorations. We're talking lampshades made of human skin, chairs upholstered with flesh, skull bowls, and even a belt made out of nipples. Oh, and he didn't just stop at grave robbing. He murdered women to get fresher materials. Gein even sewed together a full-body woman suit from human skin, allegedly so he could become his mother. So yeah, Norman wearing a dress and speaking in his mother's voice, that's the PG-13 version of Ed Gein's reality. Joffrey the Gentle. You hated Joffrey. I hated Joffrey. Your grandma, who's never seen Game of Thrones, hated Joffrey. But what if I told you the real-life version was even worse? As the spoiled, sadistic boy king in Game of Thrones, Joffrey had absolute power and zero self-control. A deadly combo that made him the most punchable face in television history. And as it turns out, Westeros didn't just pull this disaster out of thin air, because history had already given us the prototype. Meet Edward of Lancaster, son of Henry VI, a prince with all the power, zero impulse control, and a bloodlust that made medieval England say, should we be worried? Joffrey took pleasure in torture, executions, and randomly demanding people's head, just because he felt like it. Edward, same energy. Historical records suggest that even as a child, Edward was demanding beheadings like it was his favorite hobby. Imagine being 10 years old and saying, "You know what would make snack time more fun? A public execution." Both were born into power. Both let it go straight to their heads, and spoiler alert, both had extremely bad endings. Joffrey got poisoned at his wedding, and Edward stabbed to death in battle. Turns out, throwing royal tantrums and ordering executions isn't a long-term survival strategy. Both got yeeted out of history before they could grow a beard. Pennywise. You ever wonder why clowns went from goofy birthday performers to full-blown nightmare fuel? Well, meet Pennywise, the nightmare in grease paint, responsible for millions of childhood trust issues. He's a cosmic horror that wakes up every 27 years to literally feast on fear. If that wasn't bad enough, he prefers his meals terrified, so he'll shapeshift into your worst nightmare, psychologically torment you, and then drag you into the sewer like it's his personal fast food drive-thru. And while Pennywise is a Stephen King fever dream, his real-world counterpart is, unfortunately, not so fictional. Enter John Wayne Gacy. Gacy wasn't some lurking sewer monster. He was a respected businessman, active in his community, and here's the creepy part, a part-time clown performer known as Pogo. He entertained kids at parties, shook hands with politicians, and then went home to bury bodies under his house. Between 1972 and 1978, Gacy lured over 30 young men and boys into his home, committing crimes so horrific they make Pennywise look like a harmless birthday clown just trying to do his job. While Stephen King never outright confirmed Gacy as Pennywise's inspiration, the similarities are hard to ignore. Both used clown personas to gain trust. Both operated in places where people felt safe. And both left a trail of nightmares behind them. The difference? Pennywise can be defeated with the power of friendship. Gacy, yeah, not so much. Real talk. Who's scarier? Pennywise or an actual serial killer who dressed as a clown? Jabba the Hutt. The galactic crime lord, intergalactic slug mafia boss, and peak definition of money over everything, including personal hygiene. The dude sits on his throne of corruption, surrounded by bounty hunters, enslaved dancers, and enough food to keep a small planet fed for years. He's the kind of villain who doesn't chase his enemies because he physically can't. But if you cross him, congratulations, you just won a one-way trip to the Rancor pit. But believe it or not, this giant space slug was actually modeled after a real person, legendary actor Sidney Greenstreet. If you don't know Greenstreet, he was the go-to Hollywood crime boss in the 1940s, playing roles in classics like Casablanca and The Maltese Falcon. Greenstreet had an iconic presence, known for his massive frame, booming voice, and a personality that could make even the toughest guy sweat. Sound familiar? Jabba is basically him, if he traded cigars for live frogs. Visually, Lucasfilm took Greenstreet's intimidating, larger-than-life persona and cranked it up to disgusting space slug levels. But the attitude? The mix of charm, menace, and the ability to ruin your life with a single order. That was all Greenstreet minus the slime. Red Skull. Red Skull isn't just another comic book villain. He's what happens when Marvel looked at Hitler and thought, needs more edge. Unlike most supervillains, who are pure fiction, Red Skull was directly inspired by real-life figures, Adolf Hitler and Heinrich Himmler. Because apparently, history wasn't terrifying enough on its own. In the comics, Johann Schmidt, better known as Red Skull, was Hitler's top enforcer and the face of Nazi terror. While Hitler was busy ranting in bunkers and Himmler was micromanaging genocide, Red Skull was out there taking Nazi ideology and strapping it to every sci-fi superweapon he could get his hands on. Biological warfare, mind control, death rays, you name it. Red Skull tried to use it to rule the world, and the worst part, his methods weren't just villain of the weak nonsense, like the real-life figures he was based on. Red Skull believed in absolute power through fear, racial supremacy, and wiping out anyone who didn't fit his twisted vision of the future. While the real Nazis committed atrocities through war and propaganda, Red Skull did the same, just with extra lasers and cosmic cubes. Judge Holden. Imagine if a war criminal, a philosophy professor, and the boogeyman got thrown into a blender, and the result decided to take up scalp collecting as a hobby. Sounds made up? Nope. Judge Holden might be the most terrifying real-life villain you've never heard of. The real Holden comes from My Confession, the memoir of Samuel Chamberlain, who described him as an unnervingly intelligent scalp hunter in the mid-1800s. 7 feet tall, fluent in multiple languages, could out-debate Socrates one moment and scalp you the next. Imagine showing up to a saloon, and there's a hairless giant playing the fiddle, discussing metaphysics, and casually buying children just so he can watch them die. In Blood Meridian, Holden doesn't just kill, he turns slaughter into a lifestyle. He leads the Glanton gang on a scalping spree across the Southwest, wiping out villages and massacring unarmed tribes. And let's talk about scalping. Was he trying to compensate for his own chrome dome? Or was he just jealous of every man with a full head of hair? Either way, the man took bald rage to a whole new level. And when he's not busy turning the Wild West into a horror movie, he's dancing naked in the desert like a hairless cryptid with a PhD in genocide. And here's the worst part. He never dies. By the end, while everyone else is suffering, Holden is thriving, joyfully waltzing like he just won America's Got Atrocities. If the real Judge Holden was anything like this, then Blood Meridian isn't historical fiction. It's just the worst documentary of all time. So, that concludes the list, guys. Thanks for watching, and stay safe.